Miatta, I think you're more concerned by private debt levels than public debt levels.
Yeah,
is that right?
absolutely. And I think there are two parts of it. So I think on public debt, we've had this huge emphasis on it, despite the fact that actually private debt is about 4 times the size of public debt. I think if you put it in context, so gross government debt as a percentage of GDP in the UK is about 87%. That's lower than the US, that's lower than France, it's lower than Spain. And so I think in the context of the kind of fever around austerity, around the deficit, we've lost sight of the purpose of public debt, which is to do 2 things: to invest in the economy, to generate gains. So businesses do it all the time. They borrow to invest because it's going to yield a return. And that's exactly what governments should do. The second thing is that it allows you to smooth across generations. So if you're going to build a hospital that's going to benefit everyone for 200 years, it's kind of not fair to ask today's taxpayer to foot the whole bill. The purpose of borrowing is that you smooth it over. So I think there's a much bigger private debt problem, which is now about 13% bigger than it was in 2008 when we had the financial crisis, and yet we're not talking about it. And every time we decide to reduce public debt, or we say, actually, we're going to have austerity, the trade-off is that the private sector picking it up. So we've seen an increase in private debt.
Is there an issue of international competitiveness? I mean, if one central bank, or say 9 central banks, does the sort of thing you're advocating, what happens about the rest of the world? And how do we compete in those circumstances?
Well, I think there are lots of different things you could do to drive competitiveness. We're already hugely competitive. So, our taxation, corporation tax, the regulation, our economy was pretty stable until Brexit. It's become very unstable. So there are lots of different things that speak to competitiveness that I think still allows us to do the things that we need to.
Do we all need a conversation in the country about how much money we actually want? I mean, beyond the obvious answer, as much as possible. Do we need to think more about the sort of shape of our lives and when we need money and what we need it for, Miatta?
Yes, I think we absolutely do. I think Alison's completely right. And for me, it's not, I think there's a specific problem with young people, but I think it's a bigger and broader problem. We are hugely indebted. There are 3 million people who are severely indebted. And by that, I mean their interest payments are just hoovering up a huge amount of their income. And, they're not hugely indebted because they're sort of throwing money at reckless things. It's because they're absolutely desperate. So, in the context where wages have been stagnant for a decade, where the cost of things like housing, energy, food have been going up, people are massively squeezed. So they're having to just borrow just to live, to get by, to feed their kids, to heat their homes. And so we've got this crisis. And then we've got parts of the financial sector, lenders that are lending to people at pretty exorbitant rates that are kind of exploiting that. And there is something fundamentally wrong with that. So I think we have to try and address that. And that's in part, you can educate people, you can help them. And
you come back to politics, you come back to electing people to re-regulate those parts of the financial sector.
Absolutely. You've got to re-regulate it. And so one of the things that, for example, was done with payday lenders, which was to say we're going to cap the cost of borrowing. So you can't borrow more than double the value of what you originally borrowed. You can't pay back more than double the amount that you borrowed. I think is something that we could do to other forms of consumer credit. And that will require us to think about writing off some of this debt. And I think, the private sector that in some respects, the banking system that lended a little bit recklessly, I think ought to foot some of the bill for that.